This is a News Nation alert. New footage reveals a crisis unlike anything we've seen.
Footage emerging from deep inside Florida's swamps has exposed a very disturbing scene. Through water thick with debris, the landscape is being reshaped by forces that seem to move without pause. Something large is pushing its way across the wetlands, changing the rhythm of the entire place. The swamp itself appears to react as if it has been holding on for too long. But what comes next reveals a threat nobody expected to confront. Join us as we unveil this wildlife mystery and the aftermath. The deadly invasion. The Florida Everglades once moved like a long, slow river made of grass, stretching across a huge part of the state. It was more than a swamp. The land supported water systems, protected nearby cities, and carried a value that reached into billions each year. Everything here depended on balance. Birds filled the sky in great numbers, and small animals moved through the thick grass. Predators followed them through the hammocks, and the whole region worked as a single living system that seemed strong enough to last forever. However, that sense of stability did not hold. The chain of events that changed everything began with a storm in 1992 when a massive hurricane tore across southern Florida. Strong winds destroyed homes, pushed trees to the ground, and swept through anything that stood in their way. Near Miami, the storm damaged a reptile facility, and large snakes native to Southeast Asia slipped into the wetlands. Unfortunately, at the same time, another problem was building. Through the 1980s and 90s, many people bought exotic snakes as pets, thinking they would stay small. They did not know these animals could grow several feet within a few short years. As the pets became too large and too strong to handle, many owners did not know what else to do. They drove out to the edges of the Everglades and released them, hoping the animals would simply disappear into the wild. Instead, the releases added a fast-growing predator into a sensitive ecosystem. Some people later suggested that a single facility might have held far more snakes than anyone admitted. And when the hurricane struck, large numbers escaped at once. No one ever proved what truly happened, but the speed of the invasion raised questions. For a long time, the snakes stayed mostly unseen, and people thought little of them. While the attention stayed low, the snakes were spreading. The Everglades offered warm temperatures, steady water, and an endless supply of prey. Native animals had no defenses against such a hunter, and the snakes used every advantage they had. They blended into grass and mud, making them nearly impossible to spot. Their bodies carried sensors that detected heat, allowing them to track animals even without light. Nothing in the marsh prepared the small mammals for a creature like this, and the breeding power of the snakes increased the danger. One large female could produce many eggs, and no local predator stood a chance of reducing their numbers. As years passed, their population exploded. Estimates now place them in the hundreds of thousands across southern Florida. Those who knew the Everglades well felt it early. The small animals that once filled the grass began to vanish. Studies later confirmed how severe the losses were. Raccoons, opossums, and bobcats fell to very low levels. These animals once shaped the base of the food web. Without them, predators had little to hunt, and plants lost important parts of their natural cycle. Roads that once required drivers to move aside for crossing wildlife now stretched for long distances without a single creature in sight. The emptiness spread across marsh, forest, and grass. The snakes had taken hold of an ecosystem that depended on harmony, and they pulled it apart piece by piece. Officials soon realized the problem was already far beyond a simple fix. The invaders were hard to find, hard to track, and hard to remove. By the time the danger became clear, the damage was already deep. The Everglades had lost much of its living network, and the predator causing it moved like a shadow through the swamp. People looked for ways to slow the spread, but the snakes continued to adapt. The land that was once full of so much life now faced a future shaped by an animal that did not belong there. But the worst part of the growing realization was that the snakes were not the only creatures arriving from other parts of the world. The challenge and trials. Florida reached a point where it could no longer ignore what was happening in the Everglades. and the response that followed looked more like entertainment than science. In 2013, the state launched a public challenge that invited anyone willing to step into the swamp and remove the giant snakes that had spread through the ecosystem. Cash rewards pushed many people to join, and the event grew into something the media loved, even though the real problem was far larger than any contest could solve. Year after year, the challenge held, turning the Everglades into a stage for hunters from many places. During one of those years, hundreds of people arrived with tools, gear, and determination, all hoping to make an impact. They walked through the land, gathering as many snakes as they could. That year, they caught nearly 200 of them, and the images that spread online made it seem like a major win. The event looked strong on the surface, but the deeper truth was not as encouraging. The next year brought an even higher number, with almost 300 snakes removed. The total sounded big, but the math told a different story. The lowest population estimate sat around 100,000, and the highest reached several hundred thousand. Removing a few hundred snakes out of numbers like that barely made a dent. The snakes continued to multiply faster than people could catch them, and the Everglades showed no real sign of relief. Seeing that the contest was not enough, the state moved toward a more serious plan. They hired trained hunters who worked full-time, focusing on long days and long nights across the waterways and levees. These hunters spent years tracking, capturing, and removing thousands of snakes. Their work was steady and skillful, and they became an important part of the effort. Even with their results, though, the total number removed still represented only a small fraction of the full population. The snakes reproduced at a rate that surprised even experts. For every snake taken out of the wetlands, many more appeared from nests hidden deep in the sawgrass. The state felt pressure to try anything that might offer even the smallest advantage, so the search expanded into new technology. Drones with thermal cameras began flying over the marsh, but they had an issue. The Everglades held heat everywhere, and the snakes blended into the land so well that the machines could not separate one shape from another. The next idea involved mechanical animals designed to draw the snakes into striking range. Engineers built heated models that moved and produced sound, hoping the motion alone would draw the predators toward them. But the snakes did not behave the way the designers expected. They waited in place for real animals instead of chasing, causing the experiment to fade as quickly as it began. The scientists then turned to a more unusual strategy that relied on the behavior of the snakes themselves. Researchers took large males, placed small tracking devices inside them, and released them during the breeding season. The hope was that these males would travel toward nesting females, allowing teams to follow and remove the most productive breeders. The method worked in some cases and helped locate a few of the biggest snakes in the region, but the pace of progress was slow and the cost remained high. Each successful capture came after weeks or even months of effort, making the system difficult to scale. Meanwhile, the people working in the field noticed that the snakes appeared to change their behavior as the years passed, thereby adapting faster than anyone expected. As the failures added up, frustration spread across the region. Many tools had been tested, and many plans had been tried, yet the overall result stayed the same. The snakes kept gaining ground, and the humans kept falling short. The battle had turned into a long struggle with no finish line, and the true problem was no longer the snakes themselves. Something more dangerous was moving unseen. Small but mighty. The twist in this story formed a darker trail than anyone expected, because the real danger in Florida had nothing to do with the huge python that hunters were chasing. Deep in the tangled wetlands, something much smaller rode in with the invaders and began spreading without anyone noticing. It moved without sound or warning, living inside the bodies of the pythons that had taken over the Everglades, and it stayed hidden until it was already changing the entire region. This hidden creature was a parasite so small that researchers only found it by accident. It came into the state through the Burmese pythons, acting like a cruel reward for letting an invasive species flourish. It had a long scientific name that few people could say, but most now knew it as the snake lungworm. That name alone didn't show how much damage it could do, because the true harm became clear only when researchers began cutting open native Florida snakes to figure out why so many were turning thin and weak. Inside those native snakes, everything looked wrong. When experts opened them, they saw worms filling the tubes that carry air. These tiny parasites filled the lungs and airways by the dozens, and at times by the hundreds. Each worm twisted and fed inside the snake's body, taking energy and life as the weeks passed. The scientists soon linked this parasite to the pythons, whose homeland in Asia had shaped this pest over thousands of years. The pythons had grown tough against it, but the native snakes in Florida had no such defense. The parasite spreads with a simple cycle. A python dropped waste into the swamp. Inside that waste lay eggs. Roaches and insects fed on that waste and carried the eggs into their bodies, where they hatched. Frogs and lizards then fed on those insects. When a native snake swallowed an infected frog or lizard, the larvae entered its stomach, pushed through the stomach wall, and traveled straight into the lungs. They grew larger inside that dark space, fed on the snake's tissue, and filled its breathing passages. This slow, harsh infection drained many native snakes until they could no longer hunt. Some starved while also fighting for every breath. Many showed bleeding wounds inside the lungs, and others showed signs of severe sickness. In the worst cases, worms pushed out of the mouth as the snake struggled to stay alive. The Everglades had changed in a way no one predicted. The pythons had crushed the mammals. Now this parasite was spreading through the reptiles, forming a second wave of damage. The truly dangerous part came when the parasite no longer needed the pythons at all. It settled into native snakes and now moved from one native species to another, building a new home. This shift threatened the food chain again. Once native snakes vanished, rodents grew in number. Birds of prey lost an important food source. More changes would follow, because every part of the Everglades depended on another part to stay balanced. The parasite had proven its ability to adapt by jumping from an Asian snake to many American species. Some wondered how far that pattern could go. If a dog fed on an infected animal, no one knew what might happen. If someone handled a sick snake, the risk was unknown. For now, experts believed humans and mammals were safe, but the parasite had already shown that predictions meant little in a system changing this fast. There was one strange discovery that confused everyone. The Florida cottonmouth seemed able to withstand the parasite better than other species. Researchers could not explain this strength. Maybe it came from the snake's body, or its diet, or something in its blood. Some thought the cottonmouth could hold the answer to fighting the parasite, but nothing had been proven yet. Nothing could slow the spread. Florida had lost the first fight, and now it faced a new enemy. With no good choices left, the state reached for a wild idea: the indigo gamble. Florida had reached a point where everything felt broken. The giant snakes moving through the wetlands were already a nightmare, but the new parasite sweeping through the state made the situation feel even worse. The whole region seemed as if it had been pushed to the edge, and the land itself was struggling to hang on. Then officials unveiled a plan that had people in disbelief. This was the sort of headline that would instantly go viral for all the wrong reasons. Florida was preparing to release more snakes into the wild. Hundreds of them. People could not stop reacting. Many wondered why a state drowning in snakes thought the answer was to add even more. History had plenty of examples of ideas like this collapsing in disastrous ways. One example came from Hawaii. Mongooses had been brought in to deal with rats, but no one had considered that the two animals were active at completely different times. They barely crossed paths. So the mongooses searched for other prey and wiped out many of the native birds that made their nests on the ground. To many observers, this Florida plan felt like history repeating itself. People believed humans were once again reaching into nature without thinking about the long-term consequences. The entire idea seemed doomed, but the public only saw the surface. The truth behind the plan was far more complex. The snake being released was not a random choice. It was a creature that had been missing from this land for a very long time. It was the eastern indigo snake that had once ruled the region's forests. It is the longest native snake in North America, a strong and striking reptile that can reach up to 9 feet in length. Its scales shine with deep shades of blue-black, with a warm glow of color under its chin. However, its appearance is only part of what makes it remarkable. Its diet sets it apart more than anything else. This snake feeds on other snakes. It even takes on venomous species without hesitation. They pose no threat to it because it is naturally resistant to their venom. For a long time, it kept balance in the southeastern forest. Its range once stretched across several states, but everything changed when its world was taken apart. The snake lived in longleaf pine forests, which once covered an enormous part of the South. Those forests were cut, cleared, or altered until only a tiny fraction of them remained. The snake also relied on gopher tortoise burrows for shelter. The tortoises dug deep tunnels in the sand, and those tunnels protected many species during fires or cold spells. As the tortoises declined due to hunting and development, the indigo snake lost its homes. During the Great Depression, many people collected tortoises for food and often removed any snakes hiding in their burrows. Little by little, indigo snakes disappeared from entire states. By the late 1970s, they had become officially threatened. Their disappearance left a gap in the food chain that nothing else could fill. So the new plan was not about adding a dangerous newcomer. It was about bringing back a predator that had already played an important role for centuries. Conservationists had spent years breeding these snakes in special facilities. They had been restoring patches of forest and working to protect gopher tortoise populations so the returning snakes would have places to live. To the public, the plan seemed reckless, but behind the scenes, it was one of the most carefully built restoration efforts ever attempted in the region. Even so, fear remained. Some wondered if this would turn into another ecological mistake. Well, little did they know what they were about to experience. Rebuilding the ecosystem. Deep inside Big Cypress National Preserve, researchers spent months following a large male python fitted with a tracker. They wanted to understand how these invaders moved during breeding season, so they followed this heavy, 13-foot giant across the wetlands. One day, the team went out for another routine check. They expected to see him moving through the grass as usual. Instead, they found his long body stretched out on the ground, lifeless. His head was torn off and partly hidden under pine needles. Nothing about the scene made sense. A few days later, a camera finally revealed the unlikely hunter. A bobcat, weighing barely a fraction of the python's size, had taken it out. This discovery shook the experts who had spent years watching pythons dominate the swamp. For so long, these massive snakes ruled over everything. Now, a native animal that many thought had no chance had turned the fight around. Some believed a cold snap had slowed the python, making it easy prey, but that only explained part of the story. The bigger idea was far more interesting. Alligators had been spotted lunging at smaller pythons, pulling them underwater, and eating them. Florida panthers had been recorded taking them down as well. It looked as if the original predators of the land were slowly figuring out how to deal with the invaders. They were studying movement, behavior, and timing. They were teaching their young without ever knowing they were doing it. The land was adjusting, one hunt at a time. Still, this shift was far from enough. For every python eaten, thousands more hatched in nests. This is why the other part of the story mattered even more. The so-called ridiculous plan was not about adding new snakes. It was about returning one that once ruled these forests long before the pythons ever arrived. For decades, experts worked slowly to bring them back. Even so, there were fears. People wondered if this was the kind of scenario where a predator introduced to help ends up causing new problems. But this project was different. It focused on restoring what once belonged here, not adding something foreign. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles north of the python-filled wetlands, something remarkable happened. In a protected area in North Florida, researchers released captive-bred indigos. They tagged them and monitored their movements. Then, in the fall of 2023, cameras captured something new. Two small indigos were seen moving through the brush. They had no tags. They were born in the wild from released adults. For the first time in nearly 50 years, this species had produced young on its own in this region. It meant the land was finally strong enough to support them again. More young snakes were spotted in the following months. The land itself was recovering. The ecosystem was rebuilding piece by piece, and the indigos were part of that return. This does not mean they will clear the Everglades of pythons. They live far to the north. They are not in the same battleground. But the important part is this: nature is repairing itself in more ways than one. Predators are learning. A long-lost species is rising again. The fight is far from over, but hope now comes from steady work, restored land, and a native snake reclaiming its place. If you enjoyed this video, like and subscribe, and also click the next video shown on your screen.